Welcome to the CIO Evolution. In this podcast, we'll explore the Chief Information Officer's role in executing a new ongoing leadership imperative, digital transformation that promotes agility and resilience. How do CIOs upgrade legacy networks? What are the financial challenges CIOs face? And what are the security measures that are required in the new work from anywhere, mobile and cloud-based world?
Welcome to another episode of the CIO Evolution. I am your host, Christopher Jablonski, Director of CXO Revolutionaries at Zscaler. Today, we welcome Liz Ramey, Senior Director of Content at Evanta, to the show. I'm very excited to have her here because she is pretty much doing very similar work to what I'm doing at Zscaler. In this episode, we're going to dive into the role of the CIO. We're going to talk about their challenges, their opportunities, concerns, and motivations to get a better sense of how communities like ours and peer-driven insights better serve them. Liz, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
So you work at Evanta, which is a Gartner Company. I'm not sure how many years ago it was acquired, but you create these exclusive communities of C-level executives. I've been to one of your events recently in Minneapolis, the CIO Inner Circle. It was great. And you have these events throughout the world where you bring these executives to share ideas, validate strategies, and solve some challenges. So as a content leader, can you tell us about what you do at Evanta specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a content leader at Evanta, we align ourselves really closely with Evanta's business model. And that is by CIOs for CIOs. So I have a team of content managers who work with these CIOs in each of our communities to put together agendas that are going to help them really understand their priorities better, help them overcome their challenges. And we do this by through a survey, what we call our leadership perspective survey. And then we also gather qualitative information through phone calls. So our responsibility is to ensure that we build an agenda that the CIOs really define and curate and want to see to help them with their priorities, goals, and their challenges.
Right. Well, that sounds very familiar to me. At Zscaler, we're doing very similar things, and we're happy to be partnering to amplify the efforts. So you mentioned the leadership, was it priority survey?
Perspective
surveys. And you've published many pieces of content based on the insights from these surveys. And you shared several with me, and I explored the top priorities and trends that you've seen. For instance, in April, you wrote that CIOs continue to focus on driving efficiencies, growth, digital acceleration, etc. And now we're a half year later. What are you seeing within those priorities that may have been unexpected or noteworthy today?
I love this question. So thank you for asking it. I think it kind of implicitly recognizes that change does happen and can happen in a short period of time, even at an enterprise level. And so I would say if I'm looking at it kind of a before April and after April, I talk a little bit about the changes. The biggest shift that I've seen in those enterprise priorities that you listed, I don't think it's going to be surprising due to the economy, but the biggest shift that I've seen is an increased focus on optimizing and reducing costs. So in the second half of the year, this priority has leapfrogged digital business acceleration and customer experience, placing it at number 3 on our survey.
What is really driving the fact that it's all about cost optimization right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's due to a lot of different economic factors. I think that they're planning for a recession. There's this interesting equation of we ask our CIOs about their budgets, about their OpEx and their CapEx, and those have increased. But when I look at a Gartner survey and that says the CIO's budget has increased about 5% and inflation is at 8%, realistically, their budgets kind of seem to have gone down. if you look at it like that. So I think they have to be really careful about optimizing costs and ensuring that they're being really frugal when we're kind of staring down a possible recession if we're not already in it.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing I've seen is rationalization across infrastructure is a key driver, right? Because regardless of where the economic situation is, you need to think about platforms, right? Instead of point solutions. That's one thing that came out of some of the discussions we've had with CXOs.
Yeah, I had a CIO just the other day on a call say, this year it's about people, process, and cost optimization, which I thought was pretty funny. But I would say, Chris, that so we ask in our survey, we ask about their enterprise priorities. And I think something that would be valuable for you to hear as well as your audience is we also ask them about their functional priorities. And that's where I've seen definitely some interesting shifts. One, probably not surprising if we look at it from before April and after April, is AI and machine learning, which has moved up on kind of to the top 10 list. But the two things that I found were really surprising in that functional priorities list were one, IT and business alignment, and the other was IT strategy, governance, and operating models. So one of the reasons I find it interesting, in particular this last one, is that with the CIOs, there seems to be this need in how they operate and how they're structured in order to kind of add value to the business. So I'm hearing a lot of these CIOs saying, okay, we're moving back to this. We've been centralizing for so long, and we're kind of moving back to this decentralized way of supporting the business, so we can remove these silos to create efficiencies. I had a actually podcast this summer with the CIO of E&Y, Bernard Michael, and he was talking about how he wants to integrate his IT team so much throughout the business that there's no need for a centralized function of IT. And so I think the goal being that the business can move faster and more efficiently so they can increase productivity. And of course, going back to that other optimizing costs, it'll also help them eliminate costs.
Right. I remember a Gartner report from many years ago about bimodal IT, where one part of your operation maybe is focused on that functional part, keeping the lights on, the business apps optimized, and then you have to have another side that's looking at the innovations. You mentioned AI. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. But back then it was, hyperledger technology and 5G and all these emerging technologies that could then enhance or even create new business opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned your podcast. I wanted to quickly touch on that before we dive back into some of your survey results. So you have the next big question. You have 28 episodes under your belt. So you're ahead of me here. I've got, this is number 25. So congratulations. And you have guests ranging from chief data officers, CISOs, and CIOs. Tell us about the format of your show. I mean, I find it very intriguing. Like, is it really focused on one question and maybe some memorable highlights from some of the recent episodes?
Yeah. The next big question. So our Evanta podcast was kind of born out of the pandemic era, where we wanted to provide our communities with some insights while at the same time, speaking of bimodal and innovating, we were trying to change our business model and figure out how we're going to deliver our gatherings, while at the same time making sure that we're providing insights and opportunities for executives to learn. And so we serve at Evanta, we have, like you said, we have all of these different kind of functional heads that we're serving and creating experiences around, but oftentimes they don't overlap. So for the podcast, this is kind of the first thing that we have gone to market with that allows them to talk about business problems and business questions from a C-level perspective, not just a functional perspective. So it's about 20 or 30 minutes of a conversation with me and a C-level executive. And I ask them, what's that one question that should be talked about at every C-level meeting? What do you think has to be talked about that is going to help drive the business forward? So there's questions like, how do you prepare your board for the new SEC regulations? What's the C-level's responsibility and sustainability? How can enterprises remove complexities in order to increase the speed of change? And in me saying those questions, you wouldn't necessarily know what executive is asking. It's just a broad question. And then throughout the episode, we kind of talk through it. One of my favorites was just this last one that I did with Ellen Nielsen, who's the CDO at Chevron. She's extremely smart. She's really knowledgeable, especially in data and analytics. And she discussed why enterprises should use AI. So it was super timely, very relevant. She has a great background. I would say another highlight for me was talking to Kurt John. You might know him, the chief cybersecurity officer with Siemens. And he talked about being a technology leader and the responsibility that he has and others have to cancel out the noise that occurs in today's kind of overcrowded technology ecosystems. And it's funny, I recorded him like more than a year ago. And I think that it would be interesting to kind of fall back and ask him what he thinks about that as far as AI, which is something that Ellen talked about in her episode, where she talks about kind of this C-level's responsibility to do their due diligence around AI before they adopt it. So it was kind of a complementary conversation that was really interesting for me to have.
Excellent. Yeah, we can't help escape the AI topic, no matter where the starting point is. The implications for IT leaders, for example, not just from a cybersecurity perspective, but decisions around, are you going to build, buy, extend what you've already been doing? You probably have a host of suppliers promising new AI capabilities across the solutions you already have. So then how do you go about with procurement and doing the due diligence to make sure that data privacy and governance are a part of that consideration, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you mentioned cybersecurity, and this is Zscaler, so can't help but dive into that area. And it's a top priority for CIOs 3 years in a row. And the number one goal that you found in your data is mitigating risk. I see a figure, 81% came up. So it came up on top, beating out other critical areas like regulatory compliance and improving resiliency. What would you say is the driver, for this outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can safely make an assumption here. Based on our data and conversations, I think I can safely say that growth is a driving factor. The CIO, just like any other business leader, is responsible for driving growth. In this day and age where we're kind of we're not necessarily digitally transforming anymore, we're really digitally excelling or accelerating. The CIO is responsible for finding growth through technology. But they're also up against a lot of outside cyber threats, as you know, being part of Zscaler. And they're increased in a digital environment. So mitigating risk to a CIO has to be important because they have to be able to remove those types of obstacles that stand in their way of driving growth. I would say on the other side of it, on the other side of their goals, there's also their challenges within the cybersecurity topic. And we asked the CIOs, and their number one challenge that they said is this quickly changing landscape. So ultimately, if they can kind of stay ahead or at pace with all these kind of outside threats, they can identify these risks and then mitigate them where they can. Then they're kind of removing the obstacles from the road in order to blaze a broader, more opportunistic path for growth, which is ultimately what their responsibility is.
Is mitigating risk the chief way that they're looking at cyber risk as a whole, or are they looking at things like, say, risk transfer, to cyber insurance providers, and maybe even accepting or tolerating some level of risk as just part of being able to move at the pace they need to move to be competitive and successful?
Yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it. I mean, I think that they have to get comfortable with risk, right? And and so mitigating it is one way to get comfortable with it. I was talking about kind of growth being a factor, and I think there's also a need for increasing efficiencies and productivity. And you have to mitigate the risks, like I'm saying, like kind of you don't get rid of the obstacle, but you move it out of the way in order to be really productive and efficient. So I was thinking about this with as far as like the Gartner CEO survey. They have a prediction that by 2025, productivity will be a top 5 CEO strategic business priority. So knowing that, the CIOs and other executives as well, I think on the C-suite, they know that they need to create a more productive environment. So there's this increased importance for CIOs to create kind of a highly operational and fluid environment so the workforce can be productive. This means that data has to be available. It has to move quickly. Systems are open all the time. Organizations are adopting new tools faster, automation, AI, all of that great stuff. So all of these things, though, come with some sort of risk, and they open the organization up to the opportunity of cyber attacks. But CIOs can't say, okay, well, there's this opportunity of cyber attacks, so we're not going to do anything. It can't be a dead end, right? Where there's still a path ahead. They've just got to remove those obstacles and mitigate them so they can make a more productive environment for the workforce and for the enterprise.
Absolutely. How do you do everything that you need to do from the innovation side, competitive side, and then ensure an optimal end user experience without adding too much friction with your cybersecurity controls, if any?
Yeah.
And that is sounds like a perennial challenge, given that breaches keep happening. There has to be a better way, especially when it comes to these new sophisticated social engineering attacks that are increasingly AI driven, like deep fakes, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned AI and ML. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but in terms of the survey, we know that everybody needs to pay attention to Gen AI and traditional AI, if you want to call everything else within the umbrella of AI that. But one takeaway is that over half of CIOs said that their orgs are using generative AI, and it's pretty amazing. I'm sure in most cases it's Chat GPT or other conversational bots, but it could also be image generators, video generators, code, etc. Is it the IT organizations that are using it, or are we talking like any department in the enterprise? And what else can you say about this study?
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely across the enterprise. In fact, Evanta, like you said earlier, we hold gatherings for all these different C-level executives, and the topic of AI is being talked about even with our CHRO summits. It's on every agenda, and there's use cases in every business function. Not across the board, of course, but it's happening. And our survey, so we surveyed all different roles, and in particular within CIOs, there were 53% of them that said that they're using generative AI. But we asked them, how are you using it? And we had some typical, like you kind of said, some typical crafting communications, developing chatbots. But there were also some great, like, kind of code development and analysis, automating processes. One of my favorites was developing policy, which nobody really likes to do. So why not let the bot do it? I actually had Jay was at, and some of your team was at the Global CIO Summit last month. And I was golfing with a group of about 10 CIOs, and one of them said to me, Liz, I haven't written a single email from scratch in months, which I thought was pretty fascinating and fun. Another part of the survey results that I found interesting is the concerns around generative AI. And the top two, probably not surprising to you at Zscaler at all, is privacy and security risks around generative AI. So that's something that they're trying to figure out, how to balancing those kind of benefits versus the risks that are involved.
Absolutely. And we did see several months back some high profile companies that had some data loss as a result of using Gen AI, right? And that really created an extra wave of consideration for the protection around this new vector of data loss, in addition to everything else that you already had to take care of. But, I couldn't help notice that some of the headlines as of late show a little bit of a softening. You have this hype cycle, and I'm wondering if we're going into what is called the trough of disillusionment. If there is going to be a softening of GenAI, and there's issues with cost for these data centers and how much data is available to feed these solutions from the big the cloud providers, GPU availability. I mean, it seems like we're going to reach a limit. Did any of that come up on the golf course or in the survey?
I wouldn't say that I've had conversations with CIOs about it necessarily softening. I do think that they are very aware that it's changing their role, and that they are going to have to treat this differently than, say, other technologies. There's a Gartner analyst that said recently, generative AI will change the world faster than any innovation in history. Chris Howard, who's our head of research and has done a lot of work in AI over the last few months, he actually talks about on his recent podcast that he published, this, like you're saying, that this kind of the hype cycle and the trough of disillusionment. What he talked about is this really healthy level of doubt around AI in the market. And he's saying it's healthy because CIOs and other executives are raising these really important questions around AI that are necessary if it's going to be a part of our lives, which it is. It's going to be a part of our lives. And so we have to be able to ask these questions to get the most value out of it, but also to be really safe about it.
So I'm sure we could keep going on the AI track for a while, but I did want to pivot back to the CIO role. I was listening to a Deloitte podcast about digital transformation, and the show's host, Hanish Patel, he also cited a survey from the company that revealed that over 90% of CIOs have additional roles. Those responsibilities go beyond tech. So we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, HR, and talent acquisition. You may have witnessed this trend as well over the last 10 years where they're really becoming polymaths, right? And that means that the traditional walls that define the role seem out the window. It's not just about keeping the lights on and the data centers humming efficiently. And things are getting quite porous across the C-suite as well. There's a lot of similar responsibilities across the different roles. So what can you tell us, with the CIO being in the spotlight ever since the pandemic? I think they got even more in the spotlight. Are you hearing the same trends, the same pressures to wear many hats?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, yesterday, Mark Criskino, who's a distinguished Gartner analyst, joined a meeting at Evanta. And he was just talking about how when he talks to CIOs today, he always advises them to operate outside of just their scope of technology, right? And because it's important. For our gatherings, we have a ton of requests from CIOs, other executives, to hear partnership stories, and to hear from CISOs, CFOs, COOs, because they want to understand their expectations and how to best partner with one another. Because when they do cross over, when they do assume other responsibilities, they want to make sure that they're partnering in the best, most effective way to add value. You'll see a lot of this at our CIO summits this year, because the CIOs want to talk about leadership and influence, and not just from an IT leadership perspective, but from a business leadership perspective. Their scope of responsibilities is just broader. They're responsible for influencing and leading, just like I said at the beginning, growth and change, and really driving the direction of the company. Chris, there's a keynote that's happening in San Francisco, I believe, in the beginning of November, and the CIO of US Bank is going to be opening the day as a keynote, and he's going to talk about how his technology team is helping drive an entire transformation of their customer journey. And so he's partnered with all of these lines of business and collaborated with product, with engineering, all these other departments to accelerate some really innovative ways of operating and engaging with their customers. So that's just kind of one example of how that's happening.
I couldn't agree more. It seems like the trends now are business, process, IT, and just the very nature of what your human capital is meant to do is all completely intertwined to then drive culture, business results, and competitiveness. It is quite fascinating. So I'm going to throw a curveball as a last question. What is the mindset or the attitude of a successful CIO that does ensure that the users are happy, the technology is delivered, the bottom line is enhanced, all in a secure manner?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the most successful CIOs that I have worked with, interacted with, heard from, are those that are business leaders before they are technology leaders. And what I mean by that is there's a whole toolkit that the CIO should kind of have next to them, right? As they're in their position and leading their function. And if we defined, say, 20 different tools in their toolkit, I would say 75% of those should be solely focused on leading the business. And it can be things like, negotiating skills, because you're negotiating with your partners, you're negotiating with the customers to understand what they need. All these things that you're doing. It's leadership, it's communications, it's all of these kind of business skills. And then the technology, that stuff just comes naturally because they have that skill set. So those, like, I think of Kelly Hamilton, the CIO at Sony Entertainment. I got to do a fireside chat with her in May. And she's created this environment where IT is a business enabler. They're not an order taker. They are positioning themselves, much like some of the other CIOs that I kind of mentioned above at US Bank and whatnot. But she's distributing these teams that they're working together with the business. So there's kind of emotional ownership across the business to be a part of something that technology is enabling. She calls them like pockets of accountability, right? And this is driving real business value. It's driving growth within the business. And she's doing that. She has a background, she was a CFO, I believe. Right? She doesn't have an IT background. So she's doing this as a business leader. She's approaching it as a way to drive growth and value across the enterprise. And I think that's a really good example of someone that I have seen that has been really successful in their role.
That's an excellent response, and is what I was looking for. It sounds like a leader that is charismatic, truly understands the situation that the entire employee base is facing, and can take them on a journey, on an adventure, if you will, to the vision of the company and its purpose, is really inspiring, and hopefully more leaders follow that model.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've been listening to Liz Ramey, Senior Director of Content at Evanta. You can meet Zscaler at an upcoming Evanta event near you. I'll drop a link to a bunch of events that are coming up. And I encourage you to check out Liz's podcast that we'll also link to, called The Next Big Question. Liz, any final words for our audience?
I just really appreciate you asking me to be on the show, and I've enjoyed it. So thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us, and looking forward to doing it again sometime.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the CIO Evolution. Check back with your podcast provider regularly for more episodes. You can find more episodes along with other podcasts on the CXO Revolutionaries website at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Statements by Zscaler podcasters and guests are informational only and should never be construed as legal advice. You should consult your legal advisor on matters related to you or your business. Zscaler makes no warranties, express, implied, or statutory as to the content of this podcast, and it is provided as is. Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of the recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Copyright 2021.